In my 2 decades investigating violent crimes, I've never encountered evil quite like this. Alexandra Mitchell spent 10 days playing the perfect grieving mother, organizing search parties and pleading on television for her missing 11-year-old son, Ryan, to come home safely. The entire town of Highland rallied around her. Volunteers searched forests and mountains. Hundreds of people donated time and money to find the boy. But Alexandra knew exactly where Ryan was the whole time. She had drugged him, strangled him with a rope, placed a plastic bag over his head, and hidden his body just half a mile from their house. The most disturbing part? The violent content she watched online the night before gave her the blueprint for murder. But here's what still haunts me about this case. How does a mother look hundreds of volunteers in the eye, accept their sympathy, and let them search for a child she's already killed? Subscribe to this channel, because cases like Ryan's teach us to recognize the warning signs of family violence that could save the next child's life. There are cases that stay with you long after the courtroom doors close, long after the verdict is read, long after the cameras stop rolling. Cases that make you question everything you thought you knew about human nature, about the bonds that should be unbreakable, about the darkness that can lurk behind the most ordinary facades. The case of 11-year-old Ryan Mitchell is one of those cases. May 15th, 2020, Highland, Colorado. A small town where everybody knows everybody, where children still play outside until the streetlights come on, where mothers walk their kids to school and neighbors still borrow cups of sugar. The kind of place where nothing truly terrible is supposed to happen. But on that Friday morning, as the spring air carried the scent of fresh mountain snow, something did happen. Something that would shatter the illusion of safety in Highland forever. Alexandra Mitchell walked into the Highland Police Department at approximately 11:30 that morning. To anyone watching, she looked like what she claimed to be, a frantic mother whose child had vanished in the night. Her hands shook as she filled out the missing person report. Her voice cracked when she spoke her son's name. Ryan Mitchell, 11 years old, brown hair, brown eyes, last seen wearing blue pajamas. But here's what makes this case different from every other missing child case you've heard about. Here's what makes seasoned investigators wake up in cold sweats years later. Alexandra Mitchell knew exactly where her son was when she filed that report. She had known for hours, and what she knew would have made any rational person call 911 immediately, would have sent any normal mother into hysterics, would have changed everything. Instead, she made breakfast. She drank her morning coffee. She did the dishes. She made small talk with her boyfriend Derek when he came over. She played the role of a mother going about her normal morning routine, completely unaware that her child was no longer in his bed. The story Alexandra told that day was devastatingly simple, the kind of story that happens to families everywhere. She had tucked Ryan into bed the night before around 10:30, she said. It had been a cold May evening, the kind where you could still see your breath in the mountain air. She had added an extra blanket to his bed, kissed him goodnight, told him he could watch a few more YouTube videos on his tablet before sleep. A normal bedtime routine for a normal 11-year-old boy. She claimed she had woken up the next morning to find the front door unlocked, though still closed. At first, she hadn't thought much of it. Her older son Andrew often left early for work, and she assumed he had simply forgotten to turn the deadbolt. These small oversights happen in every household. Nothing to worry about. Alexandra went about her morning as she always did. She made coffee, she started breakfast, she texted with Derek. It wasn't until she went to wake Ryan for the day that she discovered his bed was empty, the covers thrown back, the room silent and still. Even then, she told police, she hadn't panicked. Ryan often wandered over to his grandmother's house, which sat directly across the street from their own. The old woman kept chickens in her backyard, and Ryan loved to help feed them and collect eggs. Alexandra assumed that's where he had gone, that he had simply slipped out early to visit his grandmother and play with the animals he adored. She continued her morning routine. She finished making breakfast. She folded laundry. She watered the plants on her front porch. It was only when Ryan's grandmother knocked on her door an hour later, asking if Ryan was at their house, that the terrible truth began to sink in. Ryan wasn't at his grandmother's house. Ryan wasn't anywhere. That's when the real search began. Alexandra called Derek, who rushed over immediately. They searched the yard, the neighborhood, the nearby woods where children sometimes played. They knocked on doors, called out Ryan's name, followed every path a curious 11-year-old might have taken. Nothing. Derek was the one who suggested they call the authorities. He drove Alexandra to the Child Protective Services office, then to the police station. He held her hand as she filed the report, as she answered the initial questions, as the machinery of a missing child investigation slowly began to turn. Within hours, the entire town of Highland was mobilized. This was May 2020, remember. The pandemic had just begun, schools were closed, people were supposed to stay home, maintain social distance, avoid gathering in groups. But when a child goes missing, normal rules don't apply. Neighbors formed search parties. Teachers spread the word on social media. Local businesses closed so their employees could join the hunt for Ryan Mitchell. The police acted quickly and methodically. Detective James Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the Highland Police Department, took charge of the case. He had worked missing children cases before, had seen the patterns, knew the statistics that no parent ever wants to hear. Most missing children are found within the first few hours. When they're not, when those crucial first hours turn into a first day, then a first night, the possibilities narrow in ways that chill the blood. Morrison interviewed Alexandra first, taking her detailed statement, walking her through every moment of the previous evening and morning. He spoke with Derek, with Andrew, with Ryan's grandmother. He examined Ryan's room, his computer, his phone records, looking for any sign of where the boy might have gone, any indication of what might have happened. And then he did what every good detective does in a missing child case. He called Ryan's father. Robert Hayes lived 2 hours away in Denver. He and Alexandra had divorced 3 years earlier, and Ryan split his time between both parents according to a custody arrangement that had worked well for everyone involved. Robert was at his construction job when he got the call, and he dropped everything immediately. He was in Highland by 3 p.m. that same day, joining the search, working alongside the very ex-wife who would later accuse him of unthinkable things. For 10 days, Highland, Colorado became the center of a massive search operation. Volunteers combed through miles of forest. Police dogs followed scent trails that led nowhere. The National Guard brought in helicopters to scan the mountainous terrain from above. The FBI opened a case file and sent agents to interview family members, friends, teachers, anyone who had contact with Ryan in the weeks before his disappearance. Alexandra Mitchell was everywhere during those 10 days. She appeared on local news, pleading for her son's safe return. She coordinated with volunteers, distributed flyers, maintained the tip hotline that rang constantly with reported sightings from across the state. She was the picture of a mother in agony, a woman whose entire world had collapsed in a single night. She gave interviews where her voice broke with emotion. She spoke about Ryan's love of animals, his dreams of becoming a veterinarian, his sweet nature and curious mind. She described the last conversation they had shared, how he had asked for an extra blanket because he was cold, how he had said goodnight in that casual way children do, never knowing it might be the last time. But even then, even as she played the role of grieving mother to perfection, there were signs, small inconsistencies in her story that Detective Morrison began to notice, details that shifted slightly each time she told them, a certain lack of emotion at moments when any parent should have been overcome with grief. And there was something else, something that would later prove to be the most chilling detail of all. Throughout those 10 days of searching, as hundreds of people scoured the countryside looking for any trace of Ryan Mitchell, Alexandra never once suggested they search the family property. Never once mentioned that perhaps they should look more carefully around their own home, in the outbuildings, in the spaces that an 11-year-old boy might have access to. She knew they wouldn't find anything in those places. She knew exactly why they wouldn't find anything, because she knew exactly where Ryan was. May 25th, 2020, 10 days after Ryan Mitchell was reported missing. A volunteer searcher was walking along a creek bed, about a half-mile from the Mitchell family home, when he noticed something that didn't belong, something that made him call out for the police, something that brought the massive search operation to a sudden, horrible end. Ryan Mitchell's body was found in a makeshift grave, hidden in a wooded area that search teams had passed by multiple times in the previous week and a half. The location wasn't random. It wasn't the kind of place a lost child would wander to on his own. Someone had chosen this spot deliberately, someone who knew the area well, someone who had time to plan and execute a careful burial. When confronted with the discovery of her son's body, Alexandra Mitchell's story began to change in ways that would shock even experienced homicide investigators. The grieving mother, who had spent 10 days begging for her child's safe return, suddenly became someone else entirely. Someone with secrets that were darker than anyone in Highland, Colorado could have imagined. But she still wasn't ready to tell the truth. Not yet. The truth would come in pieces, in contradictory statements, in versions that shifted and evolved as the evidence mounted against her. Each new version more disturbing than the last, each new confession revealing depths of deception that seemed almost impossible to believe. What Detective Morrison and the team were about to uncover would challenge every assumption they had made about this case, about this family, about the woman who had stood before news cameras pleading for help finding her missing son. They were about to learn that some performances are so convincing, so flawlessly executed, that they can fool an entire community. They were about to discover that the most dangerous predators aren't strangers lurking in shadows. Sometimes they're the people who tuck you in at night, who kiss you goodnight, who tell you they love you even as they plan your destruction. And they were about to understand that the search for Ryan Mitchell had never been a rescue mission. It had always been a recovery operation. Alexandra Mitchell just hadn't told them that yet. When you've spent decades working missing children cases, you learn to read between the lines. You develop an instinct for the details that don't quite fit, the small inconsistencies that most people would overlook, but that keep experienced investigators awake at night. In the case of Ryan Mitchell, those details were everywhere from the very beginning. You just had to know how to look for them. Detective Morrison noticed the first red flag within hours of taking Alexandra's initial statement. It was something so subtle that a less experienced investigator might have missed it entirely. Something that seemed insignificant until you really thought about what it implied. Alexandra had described exactly what Ryan was wearing when he disappeared. Grey sweatpants, a short-sleeved t-shirt and flip-flops. She was absolutely certain about these details, could describe each item of clothing with the kind of precision that comes from having seen them recently. Very recently. But here's what made Morrison's blood run cold. May in Colorado is brutal. The nights drop into the 30s, the kind of cold that cuts through your clothes and settles into your bones. Even the locals, people who have lived through decades of mountain winters, bundle up in layers during May evenings. The idea that an 11-year-old child would voluntarily walk outside in the middle of the night wearing nothing but a t-shirt and flip-flops defied every rational explanation. More disturbing still was how Alexandra knew what Ryan was wearing. According to her story, she had tucked him into bed the previous evening and found him missing the next morning. She claimed he slept in his underwear, that he had taken off his day clothes before bed like any normal child. So how exactly did she know what he had put on when he allegedly left the house in the middle of the night? How could she be so certain about his clothing choices if she hadn't seen him make them? When Morrison pressed her on this point, Alexandra's explanation became even more troubling. She said she knew what Ryan was wearing because those were the clothes that were missing from his room, the same clothes he had been wearing the day before. In other words, according to Alexandra's timeline, Ryan had undressed for bed, slept in his underwear, then gotten up in the middle of a freezing night and put on the exact same clothes he had worn the previous day, including flip-flops that would have been useless in near-freezing temperatures. Any parent knows that children don't think logically about weather-appropriate clothing. But even the most absent-minded 11-year-old would have noticed that flip-flops and a t-shirt weren't going to protect him from a May night in Colorado. Unless, of course, he never had the chance to notice the cold. But the clothing inconsistencies were just the beginning. Alexandra also claimed that Ryan had taken $200 with him when he disappeared. $200 that she said had been hidden inside a Bible in their living room. $200 that an 11-year-old boy had somehow known about and decided to take with him on his mysterious middle-of-the-night journey. When Detective Morrison asked the obvious question, why would Ryan need money if he was just wandering around their small town? Alexandra had an answer ready. An answer that would prove to be the first of many attempts to redirect the investigation away from herself and toward other potential suspects. She told Morrison about her brother Marcus, who lived in a house across the street from their family home. Marcus, she explained, had mental health issues and a serious drug problem. He would sometimes come to their house asking for money, and Alexandra suggested that perhaps Ryan had taken the cash to give to his uncle if Marcus had somehow convinced the boy to meet him that night. But Alexandra's story about Marcus got much darker than simple requests for drug money. She told Detective Morrison that Marcus had been inappropriate with Ryan on at least 2 occasions, that he had touched the boy inappropriately, that Ryan had reported these incidents to her. She claimed she had limited Ryan's contact with Marcus after these alleged incidents, but suggested that if Marcus had called for Ryan or come to the house that night, Ryan might have responded out of fear or confusion. It was a convenient narrative. A troubled uncle with a history of inappropriate behavior, a missing child, and $200 that could have been used as bait or payment. It gave the police a clear direction for their investigation, a suspect with motive and opportunity, someone other than the grieving mother who was cooperating so fully with the search efforts. But Detective Morrison had been working cases long enough to recognize when someone was trying too hard to be helpful. When a family member immediately provides a detailed alternative theory about who might be responsible for a child's disappearance, especially when that theory involves sexual abuse allegations, experienced investigators take note. Not because such theories are necessarily false, but because they often serve as convenient deflection tactics. The investigation into Marcus revealed some troubling information about his mental health and substance abuse issues, but nothing that connected him to Ryan's disappearance. His alibi for the night in question was solid, corroborated by multiple witnesses. More importantly, when investigators examined the timeline Alexandra had provided, it became clear that Marcus couldn't have taken Ryan even if he had wanted to. The logistics simply didn't work. Meanwhile, the forensic examination of Ryan's cell phone was raising additional questions about Alexandra's version of events. The phone had been found in Ryan's bedroom, left behind when he allegedly disappeared. For a child who spent most of his free time playing online games and watching videos, leaving his phone behind seemed almost impossible to believe. The digital forensics team conducted 2 separate examinations of the device, one by the district attorney's office and another by the state police cybercrimes unit. What they found was puzzling. The phone contained almost no personal data, no text conversations with friends or family members, no photos, no videos, no social media activity, just a few gaming apps and the basic school group chat that all the students in his class used for homework assignments. For investigators familiar with how children use technology, this was highly unusual. 11-year-olds typically fill their phones with photos, messages, social media interactions, and digital remnants of their daily lives. Ryan's phone was almost completely empty, as if someone had deliberately wiped it clean, or as if the boy had been systematically deleting his digital footprint. The technology experts offered 2 possible explanations for the phone's pristine condition. Either someone had accessed the device after Ryan's disappearance and deleted potentially incriminating evidence, or Ryan himself had been in the habit of regularly clearing his phone's memory to keep it running smoothly for gaming. Given Ryan's obsession with online games, the second explanation seemed plausible. Children who spend hours playing resource-intensive mobile games often learn to delete unnecessary files to improve performance. But even accepting that explanation, investigators found it strange that there were no recent communications between Ryan and his father. Robert Hayes lived several hours away in Denver, and he maintained that he spoke with his son regularly, usually every few days. The complete absence of any digital communication between father and son struck investigators as odd, especially given that children Ryan's age typically prefer texting to phone calls. When they interviewed Robert about his relationship with Ryan, he painted a picture of a loving but geographically complicated father-son bond. He explained that he and Alexandra had divorced 3 years earlier, that Ryan split his time between both parents according to a custody schedule that had worked well for everyone involved. Robert said he had last seen Ryan in person during Easter weekend, about 6 weeks before the disappearance, and had last spoken with him by phone the week before Mother's Day. Robert's account of his relationship with Ryan was corroborated by family members, friends, and even Alexandra herself in her initial statements. There was no indication of conflict between father and son, no signs of the kind of animosity that might drive a child to run away or put himself in danger. Ryan's friends and teachers described him as a well-adjusted boy who spoke fondly of both his parents, who seemed to handle the divorce and custody arrangement with remarkable maturity for his age. But there was something else about Ryan that caught the attention of investigators, something that several of his teachers had noticed but hadn't fully understood until they were interviewed in connection with his disappearance. Mrs. Sarah Davidson had been Ryan's fifth-grade teacher for only the first few months of the 2020 school year, before the pandemic forced schools to close. She had 30 years of teaching experience, had worked with hundreds of children over the course of her career, and had developed a keen sense for students who were struggling with problems at home. What Mrs. Davidson remembered about Ryan Mitchell would haunt her for years afterward. She told investigators that Ryan had been different from other children in ways that initially seemed like simple shyness, but gradually revealed themselves as something much more troubling. He was so quiet in class that she sometimes forgot he was there, so withdrawn that he wouldn't even say present during attendance, instead raising his hand slightly and hoping she would notice. So timid that he would ask other students to relay his requests to use the bathroom rather than speaking to her directly. Mrs. Davidson had taught thousands of children over 3 decades. She had worked with shy students, anxious students, students dealing with divorce, poverty, learning disabilities, and every other challenge that can affect a child's behavior in school. But she had never encountered a student quite like Ryan Mitchell. He wasn't just quiet, he was invisible. He moved through the classroom like a ghost, completing his work silently, never volunteering answers, never participating in group activities unless specifically assigned to do so. He ate lunch alone, played alone during recess, and seemed to exist in a bubble of isolation that other children instinctively respected but didn't understand. Most tellingly, Mrs. Davidson noticed that Ryan never talked about his life outside of school. Other children his age constantly chatted about their families, their pets, their weekend activities, their plans for holidays and summer vacations. Ryan never mentioned his mother, his brother, his home life, or anything that happened when he wasn't in the classroom. For an experienced teacher, this kind of social withdrawal in a child Ryan's age was a red flag. Not necessarily a sign of abuse, but definitely an indication that something significant was happening in the boy's life. Something that was affecting his ability to connect with peers and participate normally in school activities. Mrs. Davidson had planned to reach out to Ryan's family about her concerns. She had been preparing to schedule a conference with Alexandra to discuss her observations and potentially recommend some additional support services for Ryan. But then the pandemic hit. Schools closed. And like so many things that year, her plans were interrupted by forces beyond anyone's control. By the time she was being interviewed by police investigators about Ryan's disappearance, Mrs. Davidson realized that her window of opportunity to help had closed forever. The quiet, withdrawn boy who had sat in the back corner of her classroom had become a victim, and all the warning signs she had recognized were now evidence in a criminal investigation. But here's what Mrs. Davidson couldn't have known, what none of Ryan's teachers or friends could have suspected. The extreme shyness and social withdrawal that they had interpreted as possible signs of trouble at home were actually symptoms of something far worse. Ryan Mitchell wasn't just dealing with typical childhood problems. He was living with a level of psychological manipulation and emotional abuse that was so systematic, so carefully calculated, that it had turned a naturally outgoing child into a shadow of himself. The person responsible for this transformation was someone everyone trusted, someone who appeared at every parent-teacher conference and school event, someone who volunteered for field trips and bake sales and holiday parties, someone who had spent years perfecting the art of appearing to be a loving, devoted mother while systematically destroying her child's sense of self-worth and connection to the outside world. Alexandra Mitchell had been preparing Ryan for what would happen to him for much longer than anyone realized. She had been isolating him, silencing him, teaching him that the safest thing to do was to remain invisible and never draw attention to himself or his family. She had been training him to disappear. The investigators working Ryan's case were beginning to understand that they weren't just dealing with a missing child case that had gone tragically wrong. They were dealing with something much more calculated, much more sinister. They were dealing with a crime that had been planned for months, possibly years, by someone who understood exactly how to manipulate both her victim and the system that was supposed to protect him. But they still didn't know the full scope of what Alexandra had done. They still didn't understand how deep her deception ran, how many lies she had told, how many people she had fooled. They were still thinking of her as a grieving mother, whose story didn't quite add up. They hadn't yet realized they were dealing with a master manipulator who had spent years perfecting her performance. Someone who could cry on command, who could play the role of devastated parent while harboring secrets that would shock even experienced homicide investigators. The discovery of Ryan's body was still days away. The confessions, the changing stories, the final revelation of what had really happened in the Mitchell household were still to come, but the foundation was already cracking. The careful lies Alexandra had constructed were beginning to collapse under the weight of forensic evidence and investigative scrutiny. Soon everything would unravel. And when it did, the small town of Highland, Colorado would learn that the monsters they had been searching for in the forests and mountains had been hiding in plain sight all along. The most dangerous predator had been the one wearing the face of a loving mother. Mrs. Davidson's concerns about Ryan Mitchell had been building for weeks before everything changed forever. She had been teaching for 30 years, had seen thousands of children pass through her classroom, and she knew the difference between normal childhood shyness and something much more troubling. Ryan's behavior wasn't just unusual, it was alarming in ways that she struggled to articulate but couldn't ignore. The plan had been simple. Mrs. Davidson was going to recommend that Ryan receive psychological counseling through the school district's mental health services. She had already spoken with her colleagues about her observations, had begun documenting specific incidents of Ryan's extreme withdrawal, and was preparing to schedule a conference with Alexandra to discuss her concerns. She had even contacted the school psychologist to discuss the best approach for a child who seemed so desperately afraid of drawing any attention to himself. But then March arrived, and with it came the pandemic lockdowns that would change everything. Schools closed overnight. Children were sent home for what everyone thought would be a few weeks, but turned into months of isolation. Mrs. Davidson's carefully laid plans to help Ryan were suspended indefinitely, relegated to a list of things she would address when normal life resumed. She had no way of knowing that normal life would never resume for Ryan Mitchell, that the quiet, withdrawn boy who had worried her so much was about to face something far worse than whatever was causing his silence in her classroom, that her window of opportunity to save him had already closed. The irony would haunt Mrs. Davidson for years afterward. She had recognized the signs, had taken action to help, had followed every protocol designed to protect vulnerable children. But timing, that cruel master of fate, had intervened at exactly the wrong moment. The very system meant to keep children safe had been shut down just when Ryan needed it most. When investigators later interviewed Mrs. Davidson about Ryan's behavior, she wept as she described what she had observed. The absolute stillness with which he sat in class, as if movement itself might bring unwanted attention, the way he seemed to shrink into himself whenever adults spoke to him, as if he were trying to become invisible. The complete absence of any mention of his home life, his family, or anything that happened outside the school walls. Most heartbreaking of all was what Mrs. Davidson realized in retrospect about Ryan's extreme compliance. She had initially interpreted his perfect behavior as a positive trait, the kind of self-discipline that teachers appreciate in their students. But looking back, she understood that Ryan's compliance wasn't healthy self-control. It was survival behavior. The behavior of a child who had learned that the safest way to exist was to never ever cause problems for the adults around him. While Mrs. Davidson was grappling with what she might have done differently, the forensic investigation into the Mitchell family was revealing digital evidence that would shock even experienced investigators. The examination of Alexandra's cell phone uncovered a trail of searches and activities from the night before Ryan's disappearance that painted a picture of something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The digital forensics team worked methodically through Alexandra's phone records, call logs, text messages, and internet search history. What they found in the hours before Ryan died would forever change how investigators understood this case. On the night of May 14th, in the hours before she would report her son missing, Alexandra Mitchell had spent considerable time consuming violent sexual content online. The videos she watched weren't typical adult entertainment. They were extreme content featuring women being subjected to torture, assault, and various forms of asphyxiation. Videos where victims were strangled with hands, suffocated with plastic bags, and subjected to acts of violence that went far beyond anything consensual. The investigators who reviewed this material described it as among the most disturbing content they had ever encountered in their professional careers. These weren't videos of simulated violence or theatrical performance. They depicted real acts of brutality, real suffering, real fear. The kind of content that exists in the darkest corners of the internet, consumed by people with very specific and very dangerous fantasies. What made Alexandra's viewing history even more chilling was the timing. She had watched these videos in the hours immediately before Ryan died, suggesting a possible connection between her consumption of violent sexual content and what she would later do to her own child. But the violent videos weren't the only disturbing elements in Alexandra's digital footprint from that night. Investigators also discovered that she had conducted specific searches related to drugs commonly used to incapacitate victims. She had researched the composition and effects of substances like Rohypnol and other drugs, known for their ability to render people unconscious and helpless. Even more specifically, Alexandra had searched for news stories about people being harmed through the forced consumption of certain medications. She had looked up cases of women who had used eye drops to poison clients, stories about date rape drugs being administered without victims' knowledge, and detailed information about the effects of various sedatives on children. The pattern of searches painted a picture of someone researching methods to incapacitate another person, someone learning about substances that could be used to render a victim helpless and compliant. The fact that these searches were conducted in the hours before Ryan's death was no coincidence. Investigators also discovered that Alexandra had already obtained the means to carry out whatever she was planning. Weeks before Ryan's disappearance, she had taken a supply of diazepam from her mother's house. The medication belonged to her brother Marcus, the same brother she would later try to implicate in Ryan's death. Alexandra had removed the pills from Marcus's prescription bottle and hidden them in her own home, creating both the means to sedate Ryan and a potential way to frame Marcus for the crime. The calculated nature of Alexandra's preparations was becoming clear. She hadn't acted in a moment of rage or temporary insanity. She had planned, researched, and prepared for what she was going to do to Ryan. The violent videos, the drug research, the stolen medication, all of it suggested a level of premeditation that made her later claims of accidental death or self-defense completely implausible. But to understand how Alexandra had reached the point where she could plan and execute such a crime against her own child, investigators needed to understand the family dynamics that had led to this moment. They needed to hear from the one person who had witnessed the day-to-day reality of life in the Mitchell household, Ryan's older brother Andrew. Interviewing Andrew presented unique challenges for the investigation team. At 17, he was still a minor, which meant special protocols had to be followed to protect his rights and psychological well-being. The trauma of losing his younger brother, combined with the growing realization that his mother might be responsible, made Andrew an extremely fragile witness. The interviews were conducted by Detective Lisa Chen, a specialist in questioning child and adolescent witnesses. Chen had years of experience helping young people process traumatic events while extracting crucial information for criminal investigations. She understood how to create a safe environment where Andrew could share what he had witnessed without feeling like he was betraying his family or putting himself in danger. The setting for these interviews was carefully chosen. Instead of the stark interrogation rooms typically used for witness questioning, Andrew was interviewed in a comfortable conference room designed specifically for vulnerable witnesses. The room was equipped with recording equipment that captured every word while maintaining an atmosphere that felt more like a counseling session than a police investigation. Andrew's testimony would prove to be crucial in understanding the escalating violence that had preceded Ryan's death. But getting him to open up about what he had witnessed in his own home required patience, sensitivity, and multiple sessions spread out over several weeks. The Mitchell family home was small, cramped, and acoustically transparent in ways that made privacy nearly impossible. 3 tiny bedrooms arranged in a row, separated by thin wooden partitions that did little to muffle sound. A living room that flowed directly into the kitchen, a single bathroom, and a small storage area that completed the modest floor plan. In a house like this, everything that happened behind closed doors wasn't really behind closed doors at all. Andrew's bedroom was positioned between his mother's room and Ryan's room, making him an unwitting witness to the family dynamics that played out during the long, dark hours when most people assumed the household was peacefully asleep. What Andrew had heard in the days and weeks leading up to Ryan's death painted a picture of escalating conflict between mother and son, conflict that was spiraling toward a violent conclusion. According to Andrew's testimony, the night of May 14th had followed a pattern that had been building for months. Ryan would retreat to his bedroom after dinner, close his door, and immerse himself in the online gaming world, that provided his only escape from the tension that permeated their household. He would play with friends, chat with other gamers, and sometimes talk excitedly about victories or strategies, his voice carrying through the thin walls to the rest of the family. Alexandra had grown increasingly intolerant of Ryan's gaming habits, particularly his tendency to become animated and vocal during gameplay. She demanded absolute quiet in the house during evening hours, insisted that her children maintain the kind of silence that most families reserve for sleeping hours. For Ryan, a naturally energetic 11-year-old who found joy and social connection through online gaming, these demands were becoming impossible to meet. Andrew described hearing the confrontation that took place around 10:30 p.m. on May 14th. Alexandra had stormed into Ryan's room, screaming at him to stop playing, to turn off his device, to be quiet. But this wasn't a typical parental request for children to settle down for the night. According to Andrew, Alexandra's rage was disproportionate and frightening, the kind of anger that made him pull his blankets over his head and pretend to be asleep. The digital evidence corroborated Andrew's timeline. Ryan's last activity on his gaming platform was recorded at approximately 12:30 a.m. on May 15th. After that, his online presence went completely dark. No more games, no more messages, no more signs of the lively, connected child who had been playing with friends just hours earlier. Andrew had stayed awake until nearly 4 a.m. that night, gaming with his headphones on, trying to block out the sounds coming from other parts of the house. He had wrapped himself in blankets to hide the light from his phone screen, knowing that Alexandra forbade late-night device usage and would punish him severely if she discovered he was still awake. But even with headphones on and blankets pulled over his head, Andrew had heard things that night that would haunt him forever. Sounds from Ryan's room that didn't fit the normal pattern of a child going to sleep. Movement in the hallway when everyone should have been in bed. The distinctive sound of their front door opening and closing in the early morning hours, followed by more movement, more sounds that didn't make sense. Andrew's testimony revealed that the conflict between Alexandra and Ryan hadn't been isolated to that one night. For weeks leading up to Ryan's death, Andrew had witnessed escalating confrontations between mother and son. Alexandra's demands for silence and compliance had become increasingly unreasonable, her punishments increasingly severe, her anger increasingly explosive. What emerged from Andrew's interviews was a picture of a household where fear had replaced love, where a mother's need for control had overwhelmed any maternal instinct to protect and nurture her children. Ryan had been living in a state of constant anxiety, never knowing when his normal childhood behaviors would trigger another explosion of rage from the person who was supposed to keep him safe. The pattern Andrew described was textbook psychological abuse, impossible standards, unpredictable punishments, and the systematic erosion of a child's sense of security and self-worth. Alexandra had been conditioning Ryan to be silent, compliant, and invisible long before she decided to make his disappearance permanent. But there was something else in Andrew's testimony that investigators found particularly chilling. He described how Alexandra's behavior toward Ryan had changed in the weeks before the murder. She had become more volatile, more unpredictable, quicker to anger, and slower to calm down. It was as if something inside her had been building toward an inevitable explosion. The digital evidence from Alexandra's phone suggested what that something might have been. The violent sexual content she had been consuming, the research into incapacitation drugs, the careful planning and preparation, all pointed to a woman who had been fantasizing about violence and working up the courage to act on those fantasies. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, and they painted a picture that was more horrifying than anyone in Highland, Colorado could have imagined. This wasn't a case of a child wandering off and meeting with an accident. This wasn't a random act of violence by a stranger. This was something much more calculated, much more personal, much more depraved. Alexandra Mitchell had spent months, possibly years, psychologically preparing both herself and her victim for what she was planning to do. She had isolated Ryan from potential sources of help, silenced him through fear and manipulation, and researched the methods she would use to incapacitate and kill him. But investigators still didn't know the full extent of what had happened in the Mitchell house on the night of May 14th. They still didn't understand the complete timeline of events, the specific methods Alexandra had used, or the precise sequence of actions that had led to Ryan's death. Those details would come later, extracted through painstaking forensic analysis and relentless interrogation. The full truth about what Alexandra Mitchell had done to her own son would prove to be even more shocking than the evidence already suggested. But one thing was already clear to everyone working the case. They weren't dealing with a mother who had snapped under pressure or made a terrible mistake in a moment of anger. They were dealing with a predator who had carefully planned and executed the murder of her own child, someone who had spent considerable time and effort preparing for the crime she was about to commit. The question that would haunt investigators for years afterward wasn't whether Alexandra Mitchell was capable of killing her own son. The evidence made that abundantly clear. The question was how many other warning signs had been missed, how many opportunities to save Ryan had been lost, and whether anyone could have prevented this tragedy if they had recognized the danger Ryan was facing. Mrs. Davidson's interrupted plans to get Ryan's psychological help were just one of many missed opportunities. The pandemic had closed schools at exactly the wrong time, but even before that, systems designed to protect vulnerable children had failed to recognize the signs of escalating abuse happening behind the closed doors of the Mitchell household. By the time investigators fully understood what had been happening to Ryan, it was far too late to save him. But it wasn't too late to ensure that Alexandra Mitchell would never have the opportunity to harm another child, never again be able to hide her predatory nature behind the mask of motherhood. The truth about what happened on the night of May 14th was still emerging, but one fact was already undeniable. Ryan Mitchell had died at the hands of the person he should have been able to trust most in the world. The person who was supposed to protect him had become his killer, and she had been planning it for longer than anyone realized. Sometimes the most chilling moments in an investigation come not from what people say, but from how they say it. Not from the tears they shed, but from the tears they don't. Not from the desperation in their voice, but from the complete absence of it. District Attorney Sarah Henderson had been working criminal cases for over 2 decades, had sat across from grieving families countless times, had witnessed every possible human reaction to tragedy and loss, but she had never encountered anything quite like Alexandra Mitchell. It was Thursday, May 21st, 6 days after Ryan had been reported missing. Henderson had driven to Highland specifically to meet with Alexandra, to get a first-hand sense of the family dynamic, to see the crime scene with her own eyes. Highland was a small town, the kind of place where strangers were noticed and remembered, where children couldn't disappear without someone seeing something. Yet somehow an 11-year-old boy had vanished without a trace from one of the most visible streets in town. Henderson had reviewed the security camera footage from every business, every intersection, every possible route Ryan could have taken if he had indeed left his house voluntarily. The cameras told a story that didn't match Alexandra's narrative. They showed absolutely nothing. No sign of a child walking alone. No indication of anyone leaving the Mitchell property during the hours when Ryan supposedly disappeared. It was as if the boy had simply evaporated into thin air. The technical term for this kind of absence of evidence is negative space. It's what investigators look for when the lack of something tells a more compelling story than the presence of something else. In Ryan's case, the negative space was screaming. An active social child doesn't vanish from a small town without leaving any digital, visual, or physical trace, unless something has prevented him from creating that trace in the first place. Henderson arrived at the Mitchell house in the late afternoon, accompanied by a victim services coordinator and a security officer who knew the area well. The house was exactly what she had expected from the case files. Small, cramped, situated on a street where neighbors could see into each other's front yards and hear conversations through thin walls. Not the kind of place where secrets could easily be kept, except for the secrets that were being kept right now. Alexandra greeted them at the front door with a composure that immediately struck Henderson as wrong. Not just calm, but eerily detached, as if she were hosting a casual social visit rather than discussing her missing child with law enforcement officials. She was impeccably dressed, her hair styled, her makeup carefully applied. She looked like someone who had spent considerable time preparing for their arrival, someone who understood that appearances mattered and wanted to project exactly the right image. The living room where they conducted their conversation was small and tidy, furnished with the kind of budget furniture found in countless American homes. Nothing expensive, nothing flashy, but everything clean and arranged with an almost military precision that seemed inconsistent with a household containing 2 active boys. The surfaces were too clean, the cushions too perfectly arranged, the entire space too controlled for a family supposedly in crisis. Andrew was present during part of the conversation, a lanky 17-year-old who sat quietly in a corner chair and answered direct questions with polite, careful responses. Henderson noted that he seemed nervous around his mother, deferential in a way that went beyond normal teenage respect for authority. He watched Alexandra carefully when she spoke, as if monitoring her reactions, as if he were taking cues from her about how he should respond to questions. It was during this conversation that Alexandra made a statement that would haunt Henderson for years afterward, a statement that revealed more about the family dynamic than hours of formal interviews could have accomplished. They had been discussing the children's daily routines, their typical behaviors, the kind of mundane details that might provide clues about where Ryan could have gone or why he might have left. Alexandra was describing how well-behaved both boys were, how obedient, how respectful of her authority as their mother. Then she said something that made Henderson's blood run cold. "My children obey me completely," Alexandra explained, her voice carrying a note of pride that seemed entirely inappropriate given the circumstances. "For example, if I tell them they cannot watch television, I can take this remote control." And here she reached for the TV remote and held it up for emphasis. "I can place it right here on this coffee table, and I know with absolute certainty that neither of them will touch it. They won't turn on the television. They understand that when I give an instruction, it is to be followed without question." Henderson had raised 3 children of her own. She understood the normal dynamics between parents and adolescent sons, the constant negotiations, the testing of boundaries, the small rebellions that are part of healthy child development. What Alexandra was describing wasn't normal parental authority. It was absolute control based on fear, the kind of dominance that could only be maintained through psychological manipulation or the threat of severe consequences. No teenager sits in a room with a television and doesn't touch the remote simply because their parent told them not to. No 11-year-old maintains that level of rigid compliance unless they have learned through experience that the consequences of disobedience are severe and immediate. Alexandra wasn't describing respect or good parenting. She was describing a household ruled by fear. The way she delivered this information was equally disturbing. Alexandra spoke with obvious satisfaction about her children's absolute obedience, as if she were describing a personal achievement rather than acknowledging an unhealthy family dynamic. There was no recognition that such extreme compliance from children might indicate problems rather than parenting success. Henderson exchanged glances with her colleague, a subtle communication that both women understood. They were not sitting with a typical worried mother. They were sitting with someone who viewed her children as objects to be controlled, rather than individuals to be nurtured and protected. As their conversation continued, other details emerged that painted an increasingly troubling picture of life in the Mitchell household. Alexandra described Ryan as sometimes difficult, a child who had been challenging her authority in recent weeks. She spoke about his gaming habits with obvious irritation, complaining that he sometimes got excited while playing and made too much noise for her preference. What struck Henderson most forcefully was what Alexandra didn't say. She didn't express the kind of desperate worry that consumes parents of missing children. She didn't break down describing Ryan's last known moments or their final conversation. She didn't clutch photographs or personal items, didn't ask repeatedly about search progress, didn't beg for updates about possible leads or sightings. Instead, she seemed almost detached from the reality of her son's disappearance, discussing the situation as if it were happening to someone else, as if she were observing rather than experiencing this trauma. Her emotional responses felt performed rather than genuine, calculated rather than spontaneous. As Henderson prepared to leave, Alexandra made another comment that would prove to be eerily prophetic. Laughing slightly, she told Andrew within Henderson's hearing that she kept telling him not to worry, that Ryan would probably walk through the front door any minute, laughing and claiming the whole thing had been some kind of elaborate joke. The idea that a missing 11-year-old child's disappearance could be characterized as a potential joke was so inappropriate, so fundamentally disturbing, that Henderson felt physically sick. What kind of mother suggests that her child's disappearance might be humorous? What kind of parent finds any aspect of this situation amusing? Henderson left the Mitchell house that afternoon with a profound sense of unease. She called a colleague immediately after driving away, needing to voice her concerns to someone who would understand their significance. "Something is very wrong in that house," she told Detective Morrison. "Something is very wrong with that woman. We need to look at this family much more carefully. This isn't a missing child case, this is something else entirely." But even Henderson, with all her experience and instincts, couldn't have imagined how right she was. She couldn't have predicted that within days, Ryan's body would be found, and Alexandra's carefully constructed narrative would begin to collapse completely. She couldn't have foreseen the confessions, the changing stories, the final revelation of what had really happened behind the doors of that too clean, too controlled house. What Henderson had recognized that afternoon was the presence of a predator who had spent years perfecting her disguise. Someone who understood exactly how to present herself to authority figures, how to project the image of a concerned mother, while harboring secrets that would shock even experienced criminal justice professionals. The investigation into the Mitchell family expanded rapidly after Henderson's visit. Every aspect of their lives came under scrutiny, every relationship examined, every potential suspect thoroughly investigated and either cleared or pursued. The boyfriend, Derek Walsh, became an immediate person of interest simply by virtue of his presence in the household and his relationship with Alexandra. Derek had been dating Alexandra for approximately 8 months when Ryan disappeared. He worked at a hotel in a neighboring town, maintained his own apartment, and spent several nights per week at the Mitchell house. On the surface, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be, a decent man who had fallen in love with a woman and was trying to build a relationship that included her children. The investigation into Derek was thorough and relentless. Detectives examined his work schedule, his cell phone records, his financial accounts, his social media activity, and his relationship history. They interviewed his co-workers, his friends, his family members, and his ex-girlfriends. They subjected him to multiple interrogations, administered polygraph examinations, and monitored his communications for any sign of guilt or deception. What they found was a man who appeared to be genuinely devastated by Ryan's disappearance and completely bewildered by the suggestion that he might be involved. Derek's alibi for the night of May 14th was rock solid. He had been working a night shift at the hotel, with dozens of witnesses, security camera footage, and electronic records confirming his presence there throughout the relevant time period. More importantly, Derek's behavior during the search period was consistent with that of an innocent person who was desperately trying to help find a missing child. He had organized volunteer search parties, distributed flyers, coordinated with media outlets, and used his own resources to support the search efforts. He had taken time off work, spent his own money, and exhausted himself physically and emotionally in the effort to bring Ryan home safely. The investigation revealed that Derek's relationship with both Ryan and Andrew had been positive and supportive. He had been trying to build a genuine father-figure relationship with the boys, attending their school events, helping with homework, and including them in recreational activities. There was no evidence of conflict, inappropriate behavior, or any kind of negative dynamic between Derek and either child. Perhaps most tellingly, Derek's reaction during his police interviews was markedly different from Alexandra's. Where she was calm and controlled, he was emotional and distraught. Where she seemed detached from the reality of the situation, he was fully engaged and desperate for answers. Where she deflected questions and offered alternative theories, he answered directly and provided whatever information he could. When investigators later interviewed Derek about his relationship with Alexandra, he painted a picture of a woman who had seemed like a devoted mother, but who had some troubling quirks in her parenting style. He described her as extremely controlling with the children, demanding absolute obedience and quiet in the household. He had occasionally been uncomfortable with how strictly she managed the boys' behavior, but he had attributed it to her being a single mother who needed to maintain order in a challenging situation. Derek admitted that he had sometimes wondered if Alexandra was too hard on Ryan, too quick to anger, when the boy made normal childhood noise or showed normal childhood enthusiasm, but he had never suspected that her controlling behavior might escalate to violence. Like most people who encounter psychological abusers, Derek had seen the red flags but had explained them away, attributed them to stress or circumstance rather than recognizing them as warning signs of something much more dangerous. The investigation also focused heavily on other family members, particularly Alexandra's mother, Dorothy, and her brother, Marcus, who lived across the street from the Mitchell house. These were the people who had the most regular contact with the family who would have been most likely to notice changes in family dynamics or signs of escalating problems. Dorothy Mitchell had raised serious concerns about Alexandra's financial situation and relationship status in the weeks before Ryan's disappearance. She had suspected that Alexandra and Robert Hayes might be planning to reconcile and leave town together to escape mounting debts and financial obligations. This suspicion wasn't entirely unreasonable, given the couple's history of suddenly relocating when faced with financial difficulties. According to Dorothy, Alexandra and Robert had a pattern of disappearing when creditors started pressuring them for payment. They would pack up in the middle of the night and move to a different town, leaving behind unpaid bills and angry landlords. Dorothy had seen this happen before and was worried it might be happening again. The financial investigation revealed that Alexandra was indeed facing significant economic pressure in the spring of 2020. She owed money to multiple creditors, was behind on rent, and had been juggling various payment plans and extensions to keep her household afloat. The pandemic had made her financial situation even more precarious as work opportunities became scarcer and government assistance programs were overwhelmed. Under normal circumstances, Dorothy's suspicions about Alexandra and Robert planning to run away together might have made sense. Faced with mounting debts and limited options, some people do choose to simply disappear and start over somewhere else. But the investigation quickly revealed that there was no communication between Alexandra and Robert suggesting any kind of reconciliation or joint escape plan. Robert Hayes had his own life in Denver, his own job, his own financial obligations and social connections. He had moved on from his relationship with Alexandra, maintained contact only as necessary for co-parenting Ryan, and had no apparent interest in resuming their romantic relationship or joining her in any kind of flight from their responsibilities. The phone records, email accounts, and financial records of both Alexandra and Robert showed no evidence of planning any kind of joint relocation. There were no unusual money transfers, no inquiries about housing in other cities, no communication about shared plans of any kind. Dorothy's suspicions, while understandable given the family history, turned out to be unfounded. Marcus Mitchell, Alexandra's brother who lived across the street, became a person of interest primarily because Alexandra herself had directed suspicion toward him in her initial statements to police. She had described him as mentally unstable, addicted to drugs, and potentially dangerous to children. She had suggested that he might have lured Ryan from the house using money as bait, and had even alleged that Marcus had previously behaved inappropriately with Ryan. The investigation into Marcus was thorough, but ultimately revealed a man who was dealing with serious mental health and substance abuse issues, but who posed no threat to Ryan or any other child. Marcus had alibi witnesses for the night of May 14th, no history of violence or inappropriate behavior with children, and no apparent motive for harming his nephew. More importantly, Marcus's reaction to Ryan's disappearance was consistent with that of a genuinely concerned family member. He participated actively in search efforts, provided information to investigators, and displayed the kind of emotional distress that would be expected from someone who cared about the missing child. The allegations Alexandra had made against Marcus appeared to be completely fabricated, designed to deflect suspicion away from herself and toward a convenient target who couldn't effectively defend himself due to his mental health and addiction issues. This pattern of deflection and false accusation would prove to be characteristic of Alexandra's approach throughout the investigation. As the search for Ryan entered its second week, investigators had systematically eliminated every potential suspect except for the one person who had been present in the house when he disappeared, who had exclusive access to him during the relevant time period, and who had been displaying increasingly suspicious behavior throughout the investigation process. Alexandra Mitchell was no longer just the mother of a missing child. She was the primary suspect in what investigators were beginning to understand was almost certainly a homicide case, but they still needed Ryan's body to prove their theory. They still needed physical evidence to support their growing certainty that Alexandra had killed her own son. They still needed the kind of concrete proof that would convince a jury to convict a mother of murdering her child. That proof was coming. The search teams were getting closer to their grisly discovery with each passing day. The lies Alexandra had told were about to collide with the physical evidence that would expose the truth. And when that collision occurred, the facade of the grieving mother would crumble completely, revealing the calculating killer who had been hiding behind it all along. The small town of Highland, Colorado, was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who know exactly how to blend in, how to appear normal, how to fool everyone around them into believing they are something they are not. Alexandra Mitchell had been fooling people for years, but her performance was about to come to an end. When you're hunting a predator who has spent years perfecting their disguise, you learn to look for the tells, the small inconsistencies that reveal themselves under pressure, the calculated moves disguised as spontaneous discoveries, the way someone tries just a little too hard to be helpful, to direct the investigation away from themselves and toward more convenient targets. Detective Captain James Morrison had been working missing persons and homicide cases for over 20 years. Before joining the Highland Police Department, he had spent a decade with the Colorado State Police, specializing in kidnapping and child abduction cases. He had seen every possible variation of family dysfunction, every type of deception that desperate people employ when their worlds start falling apart. But even with all his experience, Morrison had never encountered a suspect quite like Alexandra Mitchell. She wasn't just lying to protect herself. She was orchestrating an elaborate performance designed to manipulate not just the investigation, but public perception, media coverage, and community support. She was playing a long game that required incredible psychological control and strategic thinking. The phone surveillance that Morrison had implemented on May 17th, just 2 days after Ryan was reported missing, was yielding crucial intelligence about the family dynamics and potential suspects. Court-authorized wiretaps were monitoring the phone communications of Alexandra, Derek, Robert Hayes, and Andrew, capturing every conversation, every text message, every digital interaction that might provide clues about Ryan's disappearance. The surveillance revealed exactly what Morrison had expected: the communications of innocent people desperately trying to find a missing child contrasted sharply with the communications of someone who already knew exactly where that child was. Derek's phone calls during the search period were heartbreaking to monitor. He spoke with friends and family members about his fears for Ryan, coordinated volunteer search efforts, and expressed genuine anguish about the boy's fate. His conversations revealed a man who was emotionally invested in Ryan's welfare, who had developed real affection for both Mitchell boys, and who was torturing himself with guilt about whether he had missed warning signs or failed to protect a child he cared about. Robert Hayes' communications painted a similar picture of authentic parental concern. His calls with family members, former colleagues, and old friends showed a father who was mobilizing every resource he could think of to help find his son. He had taken time off work, driven immediately to Highland when he received news of the disappearance, and was participating fully in search efforts, despite the complicated relationship he had with Alexandra. Andrew's digital communications, monitored through both his phone and social media accounts, revealed a teenager who was genuinely confused and frightened by his brother's disappearance. His messages to friends described the chaos in his household, his worry about Ryan, and his own struggles to understand what was happening to his family. Alexandra's communications, however, told a very different story. While everyone around her was expressing desperate concern and emotional turmoil, Alexandra's phone calls and messages maintained an almost eerie calm. She spoke about the search efforts as if she were coordinating a community event rather than looking for her missing child. Her tone remained controlled and businesslike even when discussing the most frightening possibilities about Ryan's fate. More tellingly, Alexandra's communications revealed a pattern of subtle manipulation and deflection. She consistently steered conversations away from details about the night Ryan disappeared and toward speculation about who might be responsible for taking him. She planted seeds of suspicion about various family members and community figures, always in ways that seemed helpful rather than accusatory. The surveillance also captured Alexandra's attempts to coach Andrew about what he should and shouldn't tell investigators. These conversations were indirect but unmistakable to experienced investigators who understood how sophisticated manipulators communicate with their victims. Alexandra wasn't giving Andrew explicit instructions to lie, but she was definitely guiding him toward specific narratives and away from others. Morrison was building a comprehensive picture of a woman who was not just hiding information about her son's disappearance, but was actively working to misdirect the investigation. someone who understood exactly how law enforcement investigations worked and was using that knowledge to protect herself while appearing to be completely cooperative. The investigation was following multiple parallel tracks, as is standard procedure in complex missing persons cases. Morrison's team was exploring every possible explanation for Ryan's disappearance: voluntary flight, kidnapping by strangers, sexual predation, family abduction, and what investigators euphemistically call family-involved disappearances. Each investigative track required different resources, different expertise, and different approaches. The voluntary flight theory involved analyzing Ryan's psychological state, his relationships with peers and family members, and his access to resources that might enable him to survive on his own. The stranger abduction theory required examination of known offenders in the area, analysis of similar cases in surrounding jurisdictions, and coordination with federal agencies that tracked serial predators. The family involvement theory, which was becoming increasingly central to Morrison's investigation, required the most delicate handling. Investigating family members as potential suspects while maintaining their cooperation in search efforts demanded a careful balance of suspicion and diplomacy. Morrison needed these people to continue providing information and participating in the investigation, even as he was simultaneously building cases against some of them. It was during this complex investigative process that Andrew Mitchell made a disclosure that temporarily shifted the focus of the entire investigation. During one of his formal interviews with Detective Chen, Andrew revealed that he had been sexually abused by his biological father, Robert Hayes, during custody visits over the previous year. Andrew's disclosure was detailed, specific, and emotionally compelling. He described multiple incidents of inappropriate touching and sexual assault that had allegedly occurred during overnight visits to Robert's apartment in Denver. He explained that he had been too afraid and ashamed to report the abuse earlier, but felt compelled to speak up now because he was worried that Robert might have taken Ryan for similar purposes. The allegations against Robert Hayes required immediate and thorough investigation, regardless of Morrison's growing suspicions about Alexandra. Sexual abuse of children is among the most serious crimes law enforcement handles, and any credible allegation must be pursued with full resources and attention. A separate investigation team was assigned to examine Andrew's accusations against Robert. They interviewed Andrew multiple times using specialized techniques designed for child sexual abuse cases. They examined Robert's home, his computer, his phone records, and his employment history. They spoke with neighbors, co-workers, and anyone who might have observed interactions between Robert and his sons. The investigation into Robert Hayes was extensive and thorough, but ultimately inconclusive. The team found no physical evidence supporting Andrew's allegations, no corroborating witnesses, and no pattern of behavior suggesting that Robert posed a sexual threat to children. Robert submitted to polygraph examinations, psychological evaluations, and intensive interrogations, all of which supported his denials of the alleged abuse. More importantly for the Ryan Mitchell investigation, the examination of Robert's activities during the relevant time period confirmed that he could not have been involved in his son's disappearance. His alibi for the night of May 14th was ironclad, supported by work records, surveillance footage, and multiple witnesses. The investigation into Andrew's abuse allegations remained technically open, but Morrison and his team began to suspect that Andrew's testimony was either fabricated or the result of coaching by someone who wanted to redirect suspicion toward Robert. The timing of the disclosure, coming just as Alexandra was running out of alternative suspects to implicate, seemed particularly convenient. Whether Andrew was lying deliberately or had been manipulated into believing something that hadn't actually happened, his allegations served a clear purpose. They provided another potential explanation for Ryan's disappearance and another reason to view Robert Hayes as a dangerous person who might harm children. But while this secondary investigation was consuming resources and attention, the primary search for Ryan Mitchell was reaching a crucial turning point. 10 days after his reported disappearance, the systematic grid search of the surrounding wilderness was about to yield the discovery that would change everything. May 25th, 2020. A Monday morning that dawned gray and cold, with the kind of persistent mountain drizzle that made search work miserable, but that also preserved evidence that might otherwise have been destroyed by sun and wind. The volunteer search teams had been at work since dawn, following carefully plotted grid patterns through the forests and meadows surrounding Highland. It was a civilian volunteer, Tom Richardson, who made the discovery that would end the search and begin the real investigation. Richardson was a retired Forest Service worker who knew the local terrain better than almost anyone, who understood how to read the landscape for signs of disturbance or recent activity. He was working a grid section about half a mile from the Mitchell house, in a wooded area that search teams had passed through multiple times during the previous 10 days. But Richardson had the kind of experienced eye that notices details others miss. The ability to see patterns in the natural environment that indicate human intervention. What Richardson found was not immediately recognizable as a grave. The location had been chosen carefully, disguised skillfully, designed to appear like a natural depression in the forest floor. But Richardson noticed that the soil composition was different in this area, that vegetation had been disturbed and then hastily replanted, that the entire site had an artificial quality that didn't match the surrounding environment. Richardson called for law enforcement immediately, then secured the area to prevent contamination of what was clearly a crime scene. Within an hour, the wooded area was swarming with police officers, forensic technicians, medical examiners, and all the specialized personnel required for the recovery of human remains. The excavation was conducted with meticulous care, every shovel of dirt sifted for evidence, every stage of the process documented with photographs and detailed notes. What they uncovered was heartbreaking, but not surprising to the investigators who had been building their case against Alexandra Mitchell. Ryan Mitchell's body was found in a shallow grave, wrapped in household blankets, positioned carefully and covered with a layer of dirt and forest debris that suggested someone had taken considerable time and effort to conceal the remains. The location was close enough to the Mitchell house to be easily accessible, but far enough away to avoid immediate discovery during casual searches. The condition of the body provided crucial evidence about the timeline of Ryan's death and the circumstances surrounding it. The cold mountain air and specific soil conditions had preserved the remains to a degree that allowed forensic pathologists to make detailed determinations about cause of death, time of death, and other factors that would prove crucial in building a criminal case. The news of Ryan's discovery spread through Highland like wildfire. The massive search operation that had consumed the community for 10 days was officially over, but the criminal investigation was just beginning. The volunteer searchers who had spent hundreds of hours looking for a missing child were now confronting the reality that they had been searching for a murder victim. For the investigators who had been building their case against Alexandra, the discovery of Ryan's body marked a crucial transition point. They no longer had a missing persons case with multiple possible explanations. They had a homicide case with a clearly defined crime scene, physical evidence, and a prime suspect who had been providing false information from the very beginning. But Alexandra Mitchell was not ready to surrender the performance that had served her so well during the search period. Instead, she would attempt one more calculated move, designed to deflect suspicion and maintain her cover story. The weekend before Ryan's body was discovered, Alexandra had contacted Officer Sarah Martinez with what she claimed was an important new piece of evidence. She had found a calendar in her house, she explained. A calendar that Ryan sometimes used to make notes about things that were important to him. The calendar had a marking on May 14th, the night before his reported disappearance, that seemed significant. Officer Martinez responded to Alexandra's call and collected the calendar, which showed a heavy black circle drawn around the date of May 14th. Alexandra suggested that Ryan might have marked this date because he was planning to run away, that perhaps his disappearance had been premeditated rather than spontaneous. The calendar evidence might have been compelling to a less experienced investigator. It provided a potential explanation for Ryan's disappearance that didn't implicate any family members or suggest foul play. It supported the theory that Ryan had left voluntarily, possibly planning to return after teaching his family a lesson about taking him for granted. But Detective Morrison had seen the Mitchell house multiple times during the previous 10 days. He had conducted thorough searches of every room, examined every piece of potential evidence, and specifically remembered seeing the calendar hanging on the kitchen wall. The calendar had not been marked when he saw it during his initial investigation. Morrison's previous experience with kidnapping and missing persons cases had taught him to be suspicious of evidence that appeared conveniently. especially when that evidence supported theories that benefited the person presenting it. In kidnapping cases, perpetrators often tried to plant false evidence to misdirect investigations and create alternative explanations for their crimes. The calendar incident confirmed Morrison's growing suspicion that Alexandra was not just hiding information about Ryan's disappearance, but was actively working to manipulate the investigation. Someone who was genuinely concerned about finding their missing child wouldn't be manufacturing evidence to support specific theories about what had happened. The timing of Alexandra's calendar discovery was particularly revealing. She had presented this evidence just as investigators were running out of alternative suspects and focusing more intensively on the family itself. The calendar marking provided another potential explanation for Ryan's disappearance that didn't require anyone to have harmed him, but Morrison was no longer buying Alexandra's performance. The combination of her suspicious behavior during the search period, the inconsistencies in her various statements, the digital evidence from her phone, and now this obvious attempt to plant false evidence had convinced him that Alexandra Mitchell was responsible for her son's disappearance. When Ryan's body was discovered on Monday morning, Morrison immediately implemented a new strategy for his investigation. Instead of continuing to treat Alexandra as a cooperative witness, he would begin treating her as a criminal suspect. Instead of asking her to help solve the case, he would start building the case against her. The confrontation that would finally break Alexandra's carefully constructed facade was now just hours away. Morrison had spent 10 days watching her performance, collecting evidence of her deception, and building the foundation for a murder case. Now he was ready to bring that case directly to her. On Monday afternoon, with Ryan's body being processed at the county Morganer's office and forensic evidence being analyzed at the state crime lab, Morrison called Alexandra and asked her to come to the police station for another interview. He told her he had some new questions about the timeline of events, some details he needed to clarify now that they had found Ryan's body. Alexandra agreed to come in, probably believing that she could continue her performance, that she could maintain her innocence, even in the face of the discovery of her son's remains. She had been so successful at manipulating the investigation for 10 days that she likely believed she could continue to control the narrative. But Morrison had been saving his most crucial evidence for exactly this moment. He had been waiting for the right time to confront Alexandra with the proof of her deception, the digital trail that would make it impossible for her to maintain her lies. The interview that was about to begin would mark the end of Alexandra Mitchell's performance as a grieving mother and the beginning of her exposure as a cold-blooded killer. Everything she had worked so hard to hide was about to be revealed, and all the lies she had told were about to collapse under the weight of forensic evidence. The truth about what happened to Ryan Mitchell on the night of May 14th was finally going to come to light, and that truth would prove to be even more horrifying than the investigators had imagined. There are moments in an investigation when years of careful police work collide with raw human desperation, when all the lies and careful planning crumble under the weight of irrefutable evidence. For Detective Morrison, that moment came on the afternoon of May 25th, when Alexandra Mitchell walked into the Highland Police Department believing she could continue her performance as a grieving mother, unaware that her digital footprint had already betrayed every secret she had tried to hide. The interview room at Highland PD was small and windowless, designed to create an atmosphere of isolation and focus that would encourage honesty from people who had been living with deception. Morrison had conducted hundreds of interviews in this room over the years, had watched guilty suspects break down and confess, had seen innocent people maintain their stories under the most intense pressure, but he had never conducted an interview quite like the one he was about to begin with Alexandra Mitchell. Morrison's strategy was methodical and deliberate. He would start with routine questions, allowing Alexandra to repeat the lies she had been telling for 10 days, giving her enough rope to hang herself with her own contradictions. Then he would gradually introduce the evidence that would make those lies impossible to maintain. The phone records, the search history, the digital trail that revealed exactly what she had been thinking about in the hours before her son died. Alexandra entered the interview room with the same composed demeanor she had maintained throughout the search period. She was dressed carefully, her appearance controlled and appropriate for a mother who had just learned that her missing child's body had been recovered. She expressed what appeared to be grief and shock about Ryan's death, thanking the officers for their hard work in finding him and asking what would happen next in the investigation. But Morrison wasn't interested in Alexandra's performance anymore. He had seen enough of her acting over the previous 10 days to recognize it for what it was: a calculated attempt to manipulate law enforcement and public opinion. Now he was ready to strip away that performance and expose the truth that lay beneath it. The conversation began with Alexandra repeating the familiar timeline she had provided multiple times before. Ryan had gone to bed normally on the night of May 14th. She had found him missing the next morning. She had no idea what might have happened to him or who might have taken him. She suggested various theories about his disappearance, all of which conveniently pointed away from herself and toward other potential suspects. Morrison listened patiently, allowing Alexandra to dig herself deeper into the web of lies she had constructed. Every word she spoke was being recorded, every claim documented for later use in court proceedings. The more she lied now, the more devastating the eventual revelation of truth would be. Then Morrison introduced Officer David Chen into the interview, ostensibly to help with note-taking, but actually to conduct the digital examination of Alexandra's phone that would change everything. Alexandra consented to the phone search without hesitation, probably believing that her device contained nothing incriminating, possibly having forgotten about her late-night browsing session from May 14th. While Morrison continued the interview in the main room, Chen took Alexandra's phone to an adjacent office, equipped with digital forensics equipment. What Chen discovered in the phone's memory would provide the key that unlocked the entire case, the evidence that would finally force Alexandra to abandon her carefully constructed lies. Chen worked methodically through Alexandra's digital activity, examining her search history, her downloaded content, her communication patterns, and her app usage. The phone's memory contained a detailed record of every website visited, every video watched, every search query entered in the days and weeks leading up to Ryan's disappearance. What Chen found was a pattern of online activity that painted a chilling picture of someone researching methods to incapacitate and harm another person. Alexandra had spent considerable time in the days before Ryan's death researching sedative drugs, their effects on children, and their potential for causing unconsciousness or death. She had looked up specific information about diazepam, the anti-anxiety medication that belonged to her brother Marcus. Even more disturbing were the searches Alexandra had conducted about ways to administer drugs to unwilling victims. She had researched how sedatives could be dissolved in food or drinks, how to calculate dosages for children, and what symptoms would indicate dangerous levels of medication in a young person's system. The search history read like a how-to guide for drugging a child. But the most shocking evidence Chen discovered was the violent sexual content Alexandra had consumed on the night before Ryan died. Video after video of extreme sexual violence, featuring women being strangled, suffocated, and subjected to various forms of torture and abuse. The content was so disturbing that Chen, a veteran investigator who had seen every conceivable form of digital evidence, found himself physically nauseated by what Alexandra had chosen to watch. The timing of this violent content consumption was not coincidental. Alexandra had spent hours watching these videos in the late evening of May 14th, just hours before Ryan would die. The pattern suggested a possible connection between her sexual fantasies about violence and suffocation and the method she would later use to kill her own son. Chen compiled his findings and returned to the interview room with a comprehensive report of Alexandra's digital activity. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and completely inconsistent with the story Alexandra had been telling about her son's disappearance. Morrison confronted Alexandra with the evidence systematically, watching her composure crumble as each new revelation made her previous lies impossible to maintain. When presented with her searches about date rape drugs, Alexandra claimed she had been researching the dangers of such substances to warn Andrew about them. When Chen interviewed Andrew separately, the teenager had never heard of the drugs his mother claimed to be educating him about. The violent sexual content was harder for Alexandra to explain away. When confronted with evidence of the extreme videos she had watched, her careful composure finally began to crack. She struggled to provide rational explanations for why a mother of 2 young children would be consuming content that depicted torture, strangulation, and sexual violence. Morrison had been investigating violent crimes for over 2 decades, but he had never encountered a case where someone's fantasy consumption was so directly connected to the reality of their actions. The videos Alexandra had watched featured exactly the kinds of violence that would later be inflicted on Ryan: suffocation, loss of consciousness, helplessness, and ultimately death. As the interview continued, Morrison employed a technique he had learned during his training in interrogation psychology. He explained to Alexandra the difference between different types of homicide charges, describing how accidental deaths were treated much more leniently by the criminal justice system than intentional murders. He suggested that if Ryan's death had been accidental, if Alexandra had made a mistake, rather than acting with deliberate intent, the consequences might be manageable. This psychological approach was designed to provide Alexandra with a way to confess while minimizing her perception of the potential consequences. Morrison was offering her what appeared to be a lifeline, a way to admit responsibility while framing her actions as a tragic accident rather than deliberate murder. Alexandra took the bait. After hours of maintaining her innocence, after 10 days of elaborate lies and misdirection, Alexandra Mitchell finally admitted that she had killed her own son. But her confession was carefully crafted to minimize her culpability, to frame Ryan's death as an accident, rather than the calculated murder it actually was. According to Alexandra's first confession, she had given Ryan 2 diazepam tablets on the night of May 14th because he was being disobedient about his bedtime routine and his gaming habits. She claimed she had obtained the medication from her mother's house that same day, intending to use it to make Ryan sleep so he would stop playing games and making noise. Alexandra described giving Ryan the pills willingly, telling him they would help him relax and sleep better. She claimed he had taken the medication voluntarily, without coercion or trickery. According to her account, she had then gone to check on him later in the evening and discovered that his body had become cold and that he was no longer breathing. The story Alexandra told was designed to evoke sympathy while admitting the minimum level of responsibility. She portrayed herself as a mother who had made a terrible mistake, who had given her child medication to help him sleep, but had accidentally given him too much. She claimed to have panicked when she realized Ryan was dead, to have been overwhelmed by fear and confusion about what to do next. But even as she confessed to causing Ryan's death, Alexandra continued to lie about crucial details. She claimed to have obtained the diazepam on the day Ryan died, but investigators already knew from her mother Dorothy that the medication had been missing from the house for weeks, suggesting premeditation rather than spontaneous action. Alexandra also lied about her emotional state after discovering Ryan's death. She claimed to have been devastated and panicked, but her actions in the hours and days following Ryan's death showed careful planning and cold calculation rather than the behavior of a mother in shock. According to Alexandra's confession, after discovering that Ryan was dead, she had made the decision to remove his body from the house to protect Andrew from the trauma of seeing his dead brother. She described wrapping Ryan's body in blankets and carrying him outside, looking for a place to hide the remains until she could figure out what to do. Alexandra claimed to have initially considered hiding the body in a small outbuilding behind her house, but had realized that it would be discovered too quickly. She then remembered an abandoned house in the neighborhood where she could temporarily conceal the remains, while she decided on a more permanent solution. The house Alexandra chose belonged to neighbors who were away on an extended trip, people she knew wouldn't return for several weeks. The property contained a large storage box filled with fabric scraps and sewing materials left behind by previous tenants who had operated a small clothing alteration business. Alexandra described emptying the contents of the storage box, placing Ryan's body inside, and then covering the remains with the fabric scraps and other materials to conceal them. She claimed to have believed that the smell of decomposition would eventually alert neighbors or passers-by to the presence of the body, leading to its discovery and ending her deception. But this part of Alexandra's story was perhaps the most implausible element of her entire confession. The idea that she had hidden Ryan's body while hoping it would be found quickly contradicted everything investigators knew about her behavior during the search period. Someone hoping for their child's body to be discovered doesn't spend 10 days actively misdirecting search efforts and suggesting alternative theories about what might have happened. More likely, Alexandra had chosen the storage box because she believed the neighbors would be away long enough for the body to decompose completely, eliminating physical evidence that might contradict her preferred narrative about Ryan's death. The cold mountain air and the sealed environment of the storage container had preserved the remains far better than she had anticipated, maintaining evidence that would prove crucial in determining the actual cause of death. After providing her confession and agreeing to lead investigators to Ryan's body, Alexandra was transported under heavy security to the location she had described. The discovery and recovery of the remains was conducted under the supervision of multiple law enforcement agencies, with every aspect of the process documented for later court proceedings. District Attorney Henderson was present during the recovery operation, having rushed to Highland as soon as news of Alexandra's confession reached her office. Henderson wanted to personally oversee the crime scene processing to ensure that every piece of potential evidence was collected and preserved according to the highest forensic standards. The scene at the recovery site was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Opening the storage container and finding Ryan's body inside was a moment that would haunt the investigators, forensic technicians and prosecutors for years afterward. This wasn't just evidence in a criminal case. This was an 11-year-old child who had been murdered by the person who should have protected him more than anyone else in the world. The community reaction to news of Alexandra's confession was immediate and explosive. Word spread through Highland within hours of her arrest, and by evening, angry crowds had gathered outside the police station, demanding justice for Ryan and expressing their outrage at Alexandra's betrayal of their trust and sympathy. Many of the people in those crowds had participated in the search efforts, had spent days looking for a child they believed to be missing, had donated time and resources to help find a boy whose mother had already killed him. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming, the anger palpable, the desire for immediate retribution dangerous. Detective Morrison had to implement special security measures to protect both Alexandra and Andrew from potential vigilante violence. The police station was secured with additional officers, and both Alexandra and her surviving son were moved to undisclosed locations to prevent community members from taking justice into their own hands. The crowds outside the police station expressed feelings that were entirely understandable, but potentially dangerous to the legal process that needed to unfold. People shouted demands for Alexandra to be executed immediately, expressed wishes for violent revenge, and questioned why law enforcement was protecting someone who had committed such an unforgivable crime against an innocent child. Morrison found himself in the difficult position of protecting someone he personally believed deserved whatever punishment the criminal justice system could impose, while also ensuring that the legal process would be allowed to proceed without interference. The community's desire for immediate revenge was understandable, but it could not be allowed to compromise the careful investigation and prosecution that would be required to ensure Alexandra received appropriate punishment. But even as the immediate crisis of community outrage was being managed, investigators were beginning to understand that Alexandra's first confession was far from the complete truth. The physical evidence being collected from Ryan's body and the crime scene was already contradicting key elements of her story, suggesting that what she had told them was just another carefully crafted lie designed to minimize her responsibility for her son's death. The forensic examination that would reveal the true cause of Ryan's death was just beginning. The autopsy that would expose the real extent of Alexandra's violence against her child was still to come. The investigation that would ultimately reveal the premeditated nature of her crime was far from over. Alexandra Mitchell had confessed to killing her son, but she was still lying about how she had done it and why. The truth about what happened to Ryan Mitchell on the night of May 14th was darker, more violent and more calculated than anyone was yet prepared to believe. But that truth was coming. The forensic evidence would speak for Ryan when he could no longer speak for himself. The physical proof of what Alexandra had done would contradict every lie she had told and reveal the full extent of the evil that had been hiding behind the mask of motherhood. Ryan Mitchell deserved justice, and he was finally going to get it. But first, the world would have to confront the complete truth about what his mother had done to him, and that truth would prove to be more horrifying than anyone had imagined possible. The truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how carefully someone tries to bury it. Even the most elaborate lies eventually crumble when confronted with physical evidence that cannot be manipulated, cannot be explained away, cannot be made to fit a false narrative. For Alexandra Mitchell, that moment of reckoning came when the forensic examination of Ryan's body exposed the lies she had been telling, even in her confession. The night of May 25th was pitch black in the section of Highland where Ryan's body had been hidden. The street lighting had been broken for weeks, creating an environment so dark that investigators needed to position multiple police vehicles with their headlights aimed at the recovery site just to see well enough to work safely. This detail would prove crucial in understanding how Alexandra had been able to move Ryan's body without being observed by neighbors or passers-by. The darkness that had provided cover for Alexandra's crime also made the forensic recovery more challenging and more eerie. Crime scene technicians worked under harsh artificial lighting, their shadows dancing across the walls of the abandoned house as they carefully documented every aspect of the scene. The contrast between the sterile professionalism of the investigation and the horrific reality of what they were uncovering created an atmosphere that would haunt everyone present for years afterward. When Andrew Mitchell learned that his mother had confessed to killing Ryan, his reaction was captured on the surveillance equipment that was still monitoring his phone communications. The recorded conversation between Andrew and Derek, played later during the trial, revealed a young man who was completely shocked by the revelation, who had genuinely believed his mother's story about Ryan's disappearance. "I didn't know anything," Andrew could be heard saying to Derek, his voice breaking with emotion. "I didn't hear anything. I had no idea. She just told me she did it." The conversation revealed a teenager who was not only grieving the loss of his brother, but also grappling with the devastating realization that his mother, the person he trusted most in the world, had been lying to him for 10 days while he helped search for a brother she had already killed. Andrew's reaction during this phone call was one of the most powerful pieces of evidence that cleared him of any involvement in Ryan's death. His shock was genuine, his confusion authentic, his grief heartbreaking. This was not the response of someone who had been complicit in a murder. This was the response of a victim discovering that his entire world had been built on lies. The psychological dynamics revealed by Andrew's reaction highlighted one of the most tragic aspects of this case. Andrew had lost not just his brother, but his mother, his family structure, and his sense of reality, all in a single moment. At 17 years old, he was left completely alone in the world, orphaned not by accident or illness, but by his mother's deliberate choice to destroy their family. Understanding Andrew's position required recognizing the complex psychology of children who have been raised by abusive parents. Even when confronted with evidence of a parent's cruelty, children often continue to defend and protect the abuser because that person represents their only source of security and love, however twisted that love might be. Andrew's loyalty to Alexandra, even after learning she had killed Ryan, was not evidence of his complicity in the crime. It was evidence of the psychological manipulation he had endured throughout his childhood, the systematic conditioning that had taught him to prioritize his mother's needs over his own safety and well-being. Child psychologists who later evaluated Andrew's situation explained that victims of long-term psychological abuse often develop what researchers call trauma bonding with their abusers. This creates a survival mechanism where the victim maintains loyalty to the person harming them, because acknowledging the full extent of the abuse would be too psychologically devastating to survive. For Andrew, accepting that his mother was a cold-blooded killer who had murdered his beloved younger brother would have meant accepting that his entire childhood had been a lie, that the person he trusted most in the world was actually a dangerous predator, and that he himself had been living in constant danger without realizing it. The forensic examination that would ultimately expose the true nature of Ryan's death was conducted by the Colorado State Medical Examiner's Office, using techniques and technology that could determine not just cause of death, but the sequence of events that led to it, the level of violence involved, and whether the victim had been able to defend himself. When Ryan's body was removed from the storage container, investigators immediately noticed details that contradicted Alexandra's story about accidental death from medication overdose. Most obviously, there was a rope tied tightly around Ryan's neck, a piece of evidence that Alexandra had somehow forgotten to mention in her confession. The rope was not loose or casually positioned. It was tied with deliberate force, tight enough to have caused strangulation, positioned in a way that indicated it had been used as a murder weapon rather than as a tool for moving the body. The forensic examination would later confirm that Ryan had died from asphyxiation caused by this rope, not from any medication he had been given, but the rope around Ryan's neck was just the beginning of the evidence that would expose Alexandra's lies. The autopsy revealed that Ryan had been sedated when he died, confirming that Alexandra had indeed given him diazepam before killing him. However, the level of medication in his system was not sufficient to cause death. The drugs had been used to incapacitate him, to ensure he couldn't fight back or call for help, when Alexandra began strangling him. The most heartbreaking aspect of the forensic evidence was what it revealed about Ryan's final moments. The examination showed no defensive wounds on his hands or arms, no evidence that he had been able to struggle against his attacker. The sedation had worked exactly as Alexandra intended, leaving Ryan helpless and unable to protect himself when his own mother decided to end his life. Medical experts explained that Ryan would have been conscious but unable to move effectively when the strangulation began. He would have known what was happening to him, would have felt the rope tightening around his neck, would have experienced the terror of being unable to breathe, but the medication would have prevented him from fighting back or escaping. The forensic evidence also revealed additional injuries that supported the theory that Alexandra had physically overpowered Ryan during the attack. There were pressure marks on his torso, consistent with someone kneeling on his chest while strangling him, indicating that Alexandra had used her full body weight to pin him down while she killed him. When confronted with this forensic evidence, Alexandra was forced to abandon her story about accidental death from medication overdose. But instead of admitting the truth about her deliberate murder of Ryan, she created another elaborate lie, designed to minimize her responsibility and maintain her image as a mother who had made tragic mistakes rather than calculated choices. Alexandra's second version of events maintained that she had given Ryan the medication and discovered him apparently dead from the overdose. But now she claimed that she had tied the rope around his shoulders to help drag his body from the bedroom, and that the rope had somehow slipped up around his neck during the process of moving him. This explanation was so implausible that it immediately raised more questions than it answered. Alexandra was asking investigators to believe that she had decided to drag her son's body across the floor rather than carrying him, that she had chosen to tie a rope around a dead child's shoulders to facilitate this dragging, and that she had somehow failed to notice when the rope slipped up around his neck and became tight enough to cause strangulation. The forensic evidence completely contradicted this new story. If Ryan had been dragged across floors as Alexandra claimed, his body would have shown scrapes, bruises, and other evidence of contact with rough surfaces. Instead, his body showed only the injuries consistent with being strangled while lying on a bed, then carefully lifted and transported to the hiding place. Moreover, Alexandra's claim that she had been unaware of the rope's position around Ryan's neck was contradicted by the forensic evidence showing exactly how tightly it had been tied. The level of force required to create the injuries found on Ryan's neck could not have been applied accidentally or unconsciously, but perhaps the most disturbing piece of evidence discovered during the forensic examination was the plastic bag that had been placed over Ryan's head. This detail, which Alexandra had not mentioned in either of her confessions, provided a crucial link between the violent content she had consumed on the night of the murder and the method she had used to kill her son. The bag was not a random piece of plastic. It was a shoe protector, the kind used in stores to allow customers to try on shoes without damaging them. The bag had been deliberately placed over Ryan's head and secured in a way that would have prevented him from breathing, even if the strangulation hadn't already killed him. The use of a plastic bag as part of the murder method directly paralleled the violent sexual content Alexandra had watched on the night before Ryan's death. The videos she had consumed featured victims being suffocated with plastic bags as part of sexual torture scenarios. The similarity between her online viewing and her real-world actions suggested that Alexandra had been using the violent content as inspiration for her son's murder. This connection between fantasy and reality revealed the true nature of Alexandra's crime. She hadn't killed Ryan in a moment of anger or frustration about his disobedience. She had killed him as part of some kind of twisted sexual fantasy, using methods she had learned from violent content she had deliberately sought out and consumed. The forensic examination also definitively ruled out any sexual assault of Ryan, despite the sexual nature of the content Alexandra had been viewing. This didn't diminish the horrific nature of what she had done, but it did suggest that her motivation was more about power and control than sexual gratification. Child protection experts who reviewed the case noted that Alexandra's crime fit the profile of parents who kill their children as the ultimate expression of control and ownership. For Alexandra, Ryan wasn't a separate human being with his own rights and autonomy. He was her property, something she could dispose of when he no longer served her purposes or became too difficult to manage. The premeditated nature of Ryan's murder became undeniable when investigators pieced together the complete timeline of Alexandra's actions. She had stolen the medication weeks before using it, had researched sedation techniques, had consumed violent content that provided a blueprint for the murder method, and had prepared explanations for various pieces of evidence she expected investigators to find. Alexandra Mitchell hadn't snapped under pressure or made a tragic mistake. She had systematically planned and executed the murder of her own child, then spent 10 days manipulating an entire community into helping her cover up her crime. She had accepted sympathy, support, and resources from people who believed they were helping a grieving mother, all while knowing that she had killed the child they were looking for. The trial that would finally bring justice for Ryan Mitchell took place in January 2023, nearly 3 years after his death. By then, the forensic evidence had been analyzed and reanalyzed. Alexandra's digital footprint had been thoroughly examined, and prosecutors had built what they believed to be an airtight case against her. The jury that would decide Alexandra's fate heard testimony from dozens of witnesses, reviewed hundreds of pieces of evidence, and spent days deliberating over the complex web of lies and contradictions that made up Alexandra's defense. But ultimately, the physical evidence told a story that no amount of manipulation could change. Ryan Mitchell had been deliberately sedated by his mother, then strangled to death while he was helpless to defend himself. His body had been hidden with careful planning and calculation, and his mother had spent 10 days lying to everyone around her while pretending to be devastated by his disappearance. On January 18, 2023, Alexandra Mitchell was convicted of first-degree murder with multiple aggravating factors: the use of a deadly weapon, killing a victim who was particularly vulnerable, and committing murder by means of torture. She was sentenced to more than 30 years in prison, ensuring that she would never again have the opportunity to harm a child. The conviction brought a measure of justice for Ryan, but it could never undo the harm that had been done to him, to Andrew, to Derek, to the community members who had trusted and supported Alexandra, and to all the other children who might recognize something of their own family situations in this horrific case. Ryan Mitchell had been 11 years old when he died. He had loved animals, dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, and found joy in playing games with friends online. He had been a quiet, gentle child who had tried to stay invisible in his own home because he had learned that drawing attention to himself brought punishment from the person who should have protected him. He had died alone, frightened and helpless, killed by the mother who had given birth to him, raised him, and then decided he was no longer worth keeping alive. His final moments had been filled with terror and pain that no child should ever have to experience. But Ryan's death was not meaningless. His case led to changes in how missing children cases are investigated, improvements in recognizing signs of family violence, and increased awareness of the sophisticated manipulation techniques used by parents who abuse their children. His story became a cautionary tale that helped other investigators, social workers, and community members recognize similar warning signs in other families. Most importantly, Ryan Mitchell was remembered not just as a victim, but as a child who had deserved so much better than what life had given him. He had deserved to grow up, to achieve his dreams, to experience love and safety, and all the joys that childhood should contain. Nobody in Ryan's family cried for him when he died, because the person who killed him was the same person who should have been crying the hardest. But others cried for him. The investigators who found his body, the prosecutors who fought for justice, the community members who had searched for him, and the strangers who learned his story and were moved by the tragedy of his short life. Alexandra Mitchell may have taken Ryan's life, but she couldn't take away his memory or the impact his story would have on others. In death, Ryan became a voice for all the children who suffer in silence, all the victims whose abuse goes unrecognized, and all the families where love has been replaced by fear. His case stands as a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like mothers. Sometimes they live in ordinary houses on ordinary streets in small towns where nothing terrible is supposed to happen. Sometimes they fool everyone around them. including the very people whose job it is to protect children from harm. But Ryan's case also stands as proof that the truth cannot be hidden forever, that evil actions leave traces that skilled investigators can find and interpret, that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still be achieved for victims who can no longer speak for themselves. Ryan Mitchell deserved better than the family he was born into. But in the end, he got the justice he deserved. His killer was caught, convicted, and will spend the rest of her life paying for what she did to him. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's something. And sometimes in cases like this, something is all we can hope for.